place where he grew up, until he died at Ekeli, 80 years old, surrounded by his works. The constant activity which painting was for him can be divided into different phases, the first being his apprentice years, during which he painted himself into tradition, initially by producing youthfully clumsy landscapes and portraits, followed surprisingly quickly by confident and good paintings, culminating in a qualitative break which was also his first masterpiece, The Sick Child, in 1885-6. He was 22 years old. The second was the period up to 1892, when he painted in many styles and was clearly searching for a way to give expression to what he had within him. The canvases from this period include everything from realistic harbour motifs to classically impressionist street scenes. The third phase is the one we think of as Munchian. This is when he painted Melancholy, Vampire, The Scream, Evening on Karl Johan Street, Death in the Sick Room, Puberty, Anxiety, Madonna, Jealousy. The fourth phase began around the turn of the century, when he abandoned symbolist language and thinking and took his, by then distinctive style and method, into something else, less literary and more painterly, even as he returned to painting earlier motifs at regular intervals up until his death in 1944. Of course, there are no walls between these phases. Throughout his career, for example, he painted full-length portraits that are hardly affected by developments in the rest of his work, and he continually painted self-portraits up until the end, which belong among his best works. The long final phase itself contained a number of periods which it is possible to delimit, such as the vitalistic period, when he painted naked men and bathers, horses and labourers, or the monumental period, when he worked on various public art commissions, of which the mural The Sun in the Assembly Hall of Oslo University remains a high point. To divide an artist's productive life into phases is a way of handling it, and this feels especially important in Munch's case, since the works he is now remembered for are almost exclusively paintings dating to a particular period, numbering some 10 to 15 paintings out of a total production of more than 1,700, so familiar by now that they have become emblems of themselves, and therefore almost impossible to see as anything other than that. The style refers to Munch, and Munchian refers to the style, in a circular movement that closes the paintings off to the viewer, shutting us out. That movement belongs to modernity, the age of reproduction, along with Van Gogh's sunflowers and Manet's water lily ponds, Picasso's Guernica and Matisse's dancing women. Munch's The Scream is perhaps the most iconic image of our time. This means that the picture has invariably already been seen, so it is no longer possible to see it as if for the first time. And since so much of what Munch invested in this painting had to do precisely with alienation, with seeing the world as if for the first time by creating a distance of non-familiarity, it is clear that The Scream is in a sense ruined for us as a work of art. But Munch as an artist is not ruined. His production was so huge and so little of it has been exhibited that it is still possible to approach his pictures with fresh eyes. And by not focusing exclusively on his masterpieces, by not stopping at them, but rather seeing them as stations along a more than 60-year-long continual search for meaning, a continual exploration of the world through painting, full of failure, fumbling and banality, but also of wildness, audacity and triumph, perhaps The Scream, too, will come into its own as a work of art. That is to say, be seen as something oscillating between the ridiculous and the fantastic, between the perfected and the unfinished, the beautiful and the ugly, painted in a small town on the world's periphery, at the junction between the old and the new, at the very dawn of the era which would become our own. As a person, Munch was emotional, nervous and self-absorbed, and as an artist he was lucky in that he was noticed at the very beginning of his career and was helped in ways that fairly quickly locked him into painting, which at first was as much a way of being seen as a way of seeing, and which eventually became a way of life, the only one he knew. He never did anything other than paint. He never held a job, he didn't found a family, and he hardly spent any time on the practical matters which a life is usually full of. So in many ways, Munch's life was extreme.